Do fantasy books really have to be so damn long? Like, what's all this about? I ask this question genuinely. I am actually asking, is there a justifiable reason for fantasy books to be so... I can put these down. Long. They're bloody massive. They're so big. Do they have to be? Why? Why are they... I'm being facetious. I think that's the right word. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently because I've been getting back into fantasy, and I have some things to say about whether or not fantasy needs to be this long and why fantasy books are always so long. Now, to take us back in time, do the Wayne's World thing. I grew up on fantasy. I didn't read as a kid. As a teenager, I started getting into reading, and the very first genre of fiction I fell madly in love with, which happens to so many of us, it's a tale as old as time, was fantasy. Fantasy books are easy to love. They're escapist, and reading a fantasy novel is a lot like how we spend our time as children. In worlds of make-believe, playing games, watching Disney movies, reading fairy tales. Fantasy books are fantastical, and children love that. And so many of us continue to love it into adulthood, right up until the day we die. We love fantasy stories. And so in my late teens and early 20s, fantasy was the genre that got me to understand the addictive, beautiful, wonderful power of reading. Then I kind of grew out of fantasy, which is a really unfair thing to say. I just lost my interest in fantasy fiction. For the most part, over the last few years, I've read, a fantasy book here and there, maybe one every year will come along and tickle my interest. But for the most part, for the past few years, I have built this entire channel off first talking about books in translation, books from Japan, Korea, China, Latin American fiction, Dutch fiction. I love Dutch fiction. And then more recently, over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been reading a lot of horror fiction. I absolutely fell in love with horror, and it's all I really wanted to talk about. I've had to restrain myself from talking about horror too much. And I also love science fiction, and I read a lot of more literary fiction, although I don't really like that word either. But fantasy fell by the wayside until very recently. I am now just devouring fantasy books again. It feels great. I love falling back into the world of fantasy fiction just like I did, 15 years ago. I don't know why or how it has happened, but it's led me to the question, do fantasy books have to be so long? Yeah, I kind of think they do. I've made videos about the fact that books are often too long. I love a book that is 200 pages. I love novellas, I adore short stories. And if a book is over 400 pages long, that's kind of been my limit over the past few years. I really think it has to work hard to justify its length. And so often books that are over 400 or even 300 pages cannot justify it. And a book being too long is often to the book's detriment. It needed more editing, it needed to be cut down, its pacing needed to be developed and increased. A book being too long can be very detrimental to its impact, to its themes, to its characters. A book being too long can be a really bad thing. And yet fantasy books continue to be enormous. When you hear about a new fantasy book, maybe you read the title, you see the cover, you can expect that if you were to turn that thing on its side, it would be at least 400 pages long. Maybe 600, maybe 800, maybe 1,000 pages long. It's normal, we come to expect it. Fantasy fans don't balk at it. It just is what it is. But as someone who fell in love with fantasy and didn't think about how long fantasy books often are, and then went away for many years and has now found myself coming back to fantasy, I have to ask the question, do they have to be this long? And as I said, yeah, I think they do. And the reason why is kind of simple. A fantasy book is as long as it needs to be in order to convey certain things. By its very nature, by its definition, a fantasy story is an adventure in a world that usually doesn't exist unless it's urban fantasy or post-apocalyptic or some other technical thing that means that it's actually set in our world but it's not our world and it looks different, or it's an alternate dimension, whatever, you get it. Usually a fantasy novel involves an adventure in a world that is entirely fictional. Adventures take time. They move from scratch and they reach an epic conclusion. And those adventures have to take place in a world that itself must be written and established for the reader. That also takes time. So let's use a 640-page fantasy book that I just finished reading as an example. This is The Black Coast by Mike Brooks. It's a really good fantasy book. I thoroughly enjoyed it from cover to cover, and it is, as I said, over 600 pages long. Is that justifiable? Yes. Speaking as someone who has rolled her eyes every time I've had to read a book that's over 300 pages for the last several years now, I was perfectly happy with the fact that this thing is over 600 pages long. It has to be. The majority of this fantasy novel establishes two separate kingdoms, an archipelago island nation and a massive coastal region. And we spend most of the novel watching these two cultures collide. The archipelago nation is made up of multiple clans, and one of those clans hopped in their ships, sailed across the ocean to reach the coastal region. They did so because they were being chased away by some new evil threat. We don't learn much about it through the course of the novel. It is just this shadowy, dark thing. And the majority of the novel is actually set in a small coastal town called the Black Keep. It's not the capital city, it is a small coastal castle thing. The islanders make it to the coast, they make it to this castle, and even though the islanders over the course of the last few centuries have occasionally tried to invade, attack, burn, kill the people of this coastal area, they are now asking if they can settle there peacefully. They are refugees. Most of the novel is kind of a discussion of them settling there and how it's going to work and whether it's a good idea. And also, this castle town is one town of many in a massive region. The king, the people of the capital, people of other towns, they don't know this is going on. This is all still very new. And we watch it unfold gradually. And it's great, and I won't go into it in detail, this isn't a review. But when you have two nations, each of whom have their own histories, their own customs, their own cultures, their own languages, their own religions, their own political systems, economic systems, their own methods of social etiquette, family dynamics, stories, music, art, that's a lot to explore. And it's a brilliant setup because that kind of means the whole book is exposition. But you never notice that that's the case because these two cultures are teaching each other about themselves and you just watch it all unfold. So all of it is exposition if you think about it, but it's absolutely brilliantly well done. The peoples of these nations keep clashing in this small town because so many things about their cultures are very, very different and alien and frustrating. Two very simple examples are that the mainland people of the coastal region are very patriarchal. Women are second-class citizens, whereas the leader of this island clan is a woman. Because there is no patriarchy or matriarchy on the island, everyone is just equal. Because equality helps with survival, it's a necessity. It came naturally to them. Of course everybody's equal, everybody's useful, everybody gets on with their shit. But the Flatlanders, as they're called, very patriarchal, very clear hierarchy, which makes the islanders just seem like more progressive and better people. But then they have a massive problem as well, which is that they are incredibly homophobic. The patriarchal mainland flatland area has gay marriage, always has. What's the problem? Two men get married, two women get married, they adopt and raise kids. It's not an issue. But it is an issue on these islands where they have gender equality because there aren't many of them and they need to prioritize procreation. Therefore, traditional heteronormative family units are very important. The woman of the family can be a leader and a soldier and anything else because they have gender equality, but they're not okay with same-sex relationships because that endangers their population growth. And so both of them have progressive and conservative values in different areas, and they really clash over that all the way through the book. And I was enthralled the whole time. 640 pages. And I wasn't bored even once. Everything that happens in this book is exciting because I'm learning about two nations in immense detail. I learn their folk stories, I learn about their fashion, I even learn about their geology because the islanders don't have metal weapons. There's barely any iron on the islands at all. So their weapons are different. They sail ships. Their god is a sea monster, whereas the Flatlanders have a lot of iron weapons. And they ride dragons. Their dragons don't fly, they're basically dinosaurs that they ride around on. It's very, very exciting. They tame them, they have them in stables. It's all so exciting to learn about, and watching them clash and struggle and try to understand each other's languages as well. Mike Brooks has created an enormous world that deserves to be explored through its characters and their political and social relationships. That means the book is over 600 pages long. There's a lot to cover. And that's why fantasy books have to be as long as they are. There's a lot to get done. A literary novel or a piece of commercial fiction, a romance, a horror novel, anything of any other genre basically, is usually set in our world, so things are familiar. You don't have to have things explained to you. Traditions, customs, history, art, politics, whatever. It's our world, we know it, that's established, that's taken for granted. You might have a small cast of characters and you have to introduce them and get to know them. These characters need to be complex and deep. We need to spend time with them, grow with them, but they are people that exist in our world and are therefore going to be familiar to us. Often there are characters in more commercial or literary fiction who remind us of ourselves or our friends or our family members. In fantasy novels, there are so many added elements to the characters, because they do not live in a world that is familiar to us. Their personalities need to be relatable, we need to connect with them and care about them, but they will have personal backgrounds and beliefs and experiences that don't relate to us, and that takes time to establish. A fantasy novel needs to have characters that are as deep and meaningful and interesting and relatable as any other genre, but those characters are from a world that is not our world. It just takes so much more time and effort and energy to establish all of this. And of course, a fantasy story should be an adventure, a war, political intrigue. We want to explore this entire world. We can explore it through time and space, by traveling across mountains and seas, but also going back in time, learning about their history, their traditions, their folklore, their stories, blah, blah, blah. All of this takes time. I keep saying that, but it's true. One character might go on an enormous journey, and that journey takes time. And so you go along on that journey. You know it needs to be done, and you want it to be done. That's why you're there reading it in the first place. If a book has dragons, we want to know about the dragons and how the dragons factor into their society. The same goes for magic. The same goes for any political systems that might be unusual or strange or just interesting. Fantasy books are as big as they need to be, and they need to be pretty big most of the time. Often I find that urban fantasy books are a little bit shorter. A great example of a short and very powerful fantasy novel is Piranesi, by an author who also wrote one of the longest fantasy books I've ever read, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. They are both fantastic novels. One's 1,000 pages, the other's about 200. Susanna Clarke is a wonderful example of how a book is as long as it needs to be. Piranesi is short because it needed to be, and the opposite is true for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That's just how it works. And at this point, I do feel like this video has been for me. I've been explaining to myself this entire time why fantasy books are this big, but I couldn't help asking the question, do they have to be this big? Yes. And this video is why. Or at least it's the reason that I've come up with. I'm not sure it's a reason, but another nice thing about fantasy books being long is that it simply adds to the escapism. You get to spend more time in that space. You meet lots of characters, you explore a lot of the world, you see its terrain, its architecture, you learn about its religions and traditions and folklore. In the case of The Black Coast, much like in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, every chapter is about a specific character. We move back and forth between these characters, and there are, I don't know, at least 5, somewhere between 5 and 10 characters whose point of view we get all the way through the book, and we change from chapter to chapter. The leader of the Black Keep and the leader of the Island Clan are arguably our 2 protagonists. We spend most of our time with them, or sometimes seeing through the eyes of a third party who's in the room with them and watching them and giving us a different angle on things. For example, the Island Clan leader's daughter. So there's also a large cast of characters in this book, and that is normal for fantasy. And we need time to get to know all of these people, especially if we're going to read from their perspectives. We need to know who they are, what their motivations are, what their background is, and why we should care. What are they up to? What is their journey? What is their story? So you're not getting one story in here, you're getting many, and that is often true. In The Lord of the Rings, once the Fellowship breaks up after Boromir's death, you have 3 separate stories, 3 separate journeys, at least for a time. That's normal for fantasy. And it's especially true in Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire. Characters spread themselves all around the world and all of it is arguably interesting. And as they journey, they learn things, they do things, and we follow along. Escapism is wonderful, and the more time we spend in these worlds, quite often, the better it is, or the nicer it is, or the more fun it is for us. And I'm learning that all over again right now. Rediscovering fantasy, falling in love with the genre all over again, and remembering that fantasy books are big, long, epic things for a reason. And I'm loving it all over again. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Amy Zarrett, and she is recommending a John Scalzi novel, and John Scalzi happens to be one of my favourite sci-fi authors, although I haven't read this particular book, so yay. Amy says, I recommend The Dispatcher by John Scalzi. The novella is classic Scalzi. It has charming and interesting characters in an action-heavy sci-fi setting. The big sci-fi question the book tackles is what happens to the world if no one can be murdered and stay dead? One of the answers is that capitalism creates a new profession to profit off of it, the dispatcher. Dispatchers professionally murder people so they can come back to life, like if an operation is going wrong, for instance. Insurance companies and rich people use the service heavily, the ideas are fascinating and the characters are quirky. Also, Scalzi must be a strong ally because the dispatcher contains a trans woman character who explains her journey to the protagonist in a way that blends seamlessly into the plot. I've read the first 3 books in this series and they are all wonderful. I've never even heard of these books. I've been trying to go through everything that Scalzi's ever written. The Old Man's War series is taking time, but I had no idea this existed at all. And yes, Scalzi is a great ally. There are always queer characters in his books and they are always quirky and strange and fun. He really celebrates his own allyship and does as good of a job as he possibly can being a good ally, and I really appreciate that. He's a great guy. And I am definitely checking this out. Thank you so much, Amy, for your recommendation. Subscribe for books.